A struggling waitress pays for a millionaire's lunch daily, but what follows is something no one could have predicted. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment and let us know, where are you watching from? Let's get into it. A lost wallet, no car, and nowhere to go. His designer clothes were drenched and stained as he aimlessly roamed the streets, searching for shelter. After walking block after block, Alexander's eyes landed on a small, glowing sign, Melly's Diner. It was a modest spot, but the large windows revealed a cozy, inviting atmosphere. With no other options, he pushed open the heavy door, the bell above jingling to announce his arrival. Behind the counter, Sarah Dawson, a young waitress with chestnut brown hair tied up in a neat bun, looked up. She immediately took in his disheveled state, the soaked clothes, the unkempt hair, the exhaustion in his eyes. He looked like someone who had lost everything. "Good evening," Sarah greeted with a warm smile, tucking her hands into her apron pockets. "Can I get you anything?" Alexander hesitated. Pride had always been his armor, but at this moment it offered no protection. Finally, he sank into one of the stools by the counter and, in a raspy voice, responded. "I just need a place to sit for a bit." Sarah heard the fatigue in his voice. Without prying, she grabbed a plate and ladled out some steaming hot soup, adding a side of freshly baked bread. She placed the plate in front of him and said gently, "Here, eat, it'll do you good." Alexander stared at the food for a moment before mumbling, "I don't have anything to pay you back with." Sarah waved a hand dismissively. "Don't worry about it. Sometimes all someone needs is a little kindness." Alexander lifted his gaze, surprised. But the warmth of the meal was too inviting to resist. He gave her a small nod of gratitude and began eating, each spoonful bringing a bit of life back into his tired body. Sarah observed him quietly. There was something different about this man. Despite his ragged appearance, he wasn't like the usual customers who walked into the diner. A few minutes later, Alexander set down his spoon and looked up at Sarah. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I don't have a way to repay you right now, but I promise I will." This time Sarah smiled, her expression full of understanding. "No need. We help those who need it most." Alexander fell silent, moved by her unexpected generosity. Something about this small act stirred a feeling deep inside him, one he hadn't recognized before. He stood up, adjusted his damp coat, and before heading for the door, he turned back and said, "I'll be back." Sarah only sensed it, unaware that the rain-soaked stranger would soon turn her world upside down. The next morning, Alexander woke up with Sarah's face still lingering in his mind. The way she carried herself, so natural, so unpretentious, was rare in his world where everything revolved around profits, deals, and appearances. For the first time in years, he felt something real, something that made him curious about the waitress who had treated him like any other customer. After a brief moment of thought, he decided to go back to the diner, this time in disguise. He ditched his usual tailored suits and designer shoes, opting instead for plain, modest clothes that wouldn't give him away. He wanted to blend in, to be treated just as he had been the night before. No special treatment, no expectations. As soon as he stepped into Mel's Diner, the small bell over the door jingled. Sarah, who had been tidying up the tables, glanced up. A soft smile crossed her lips as she recognized him. "Good morning," she greeted, walking over. "Looks like you stayed dry this time." "Yeah, I did, thanks," Alexander replied, offering a faint smile. "I'd love a cup of coffee, if it's not too much trouble." Sarah gave a quick nod and headed to the counter. Alexander watched her closely, the way she moved, how she handled orders, and the effortless warmth in her smile. She seemed to carry a weight on her shoulders, yet her energy never wavered. When she returned with his coffee, she pulled out a chair and sat beside him, something she didn't often do with customers. "Everything okay?" she asked, studying him. "You seemed a little lost last night." Alexander hesitated before choosing his words carefully. "It was a tough night, but you were incredible." Sarah smiled, looking slightly embarrassed. "I just did what anyone would do." Alexander leaned in slightly, intrigued. "Do you always do that?" She shrugged. "I try. Sometimes people just need a little kindness to help them move forward." Her simple response left him speechless. Sarah was unlike anyone in Alexander's world, where people were driven by status, money, or personal gain. And so, without even realizing it, he started coming back to Mel's diner more often than he cared to admit. Alexander always picked the same table in the corner, quietly observing the ebb and flow of the restaurant while waiting for a chance to talk to Sarah. Every visit felt like uncovering another piece of a puzzle he couldn't resist solving. One morning, Sarah set down his usual coffee, catching the thoughtful look on his face. "You look deep in thought," she said with a small smile. Alexander chuckled. "Maybe I am." She pulled out a chair and sat across from him, taking advantage of the slow morning to steal a quick break. "What's on your mind?" she asked curiously. He hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Just thinking about how some people manage to stay strong, even when life throws everything at them." Sarah raised an eyebrow, surprised by the weight of his words. "You sound like someone carrying a lot of questions," he smiled. "Maybe. And you? How do you keep that smile going every day?" She shrugged, but something in her expression softened. "Because I have a reason to keep pushing forward. My daughter, Lily. She reminds me every day that I have something worth fighting." Alexander leaned in slightly, listening intently. He knew she had a daughter, but he'd never heard her talk about Lily with such raw determination before. "That must be a lot to handle on your own," he said carefully, not wanting to pry too much. Sarah gave a slow nod. "It is. But complaining won't change anything. My mum helps when she can, but she's sick, and the medical bills never stop coming." Alexander didn't respond right away. He just sat with the weight of what she had shared, feeling an even deeper admiration for her. He wanted to help, but he had to be careful. His wealth was still a secret, and he didn't want that to change whatever was growing between them. As Sarah got up and returned to the counter, Alexander watched her work. There was something about the way she moved, the way she made every customer feel welcome. She wasn't just doing her job, she was making a difference in people's lives. As the restaurant started to fill up, Alexander saw his chance to chat with Mavelle, the cook. Sarah was private, but maybe Mavelle could give him a little more insight into her life. "Sarah seems like someone special," Alexander said casually. Mavelle glanced up from the grill and smiled. "She really is. Never complains no matter how tough things get." Alexander nodded, keeping his tone light. "Must be a lot for her to carry every day." Mavelle sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. She always went above and beyond, even when she didn't have to. Stubborn as ever, she put everyone else's needs before her own. Mavelle's words lingered in Alexander's mind as he finished his coffee. Sarah wasn't just a kind waitress, she was a fighter. Someone who met life's struggles with both resilience and generosity. Later that afternoon, she approached Alexander's table with a playful smirk. "You're here so often, I think it's time you start paying rent." Alexander Riol chuckled at her, teasing. "Maybe I should start helping out in the kitchen." Sarah tilted her head, pretending to give it some serious thought. "Well, if you know your way around a sink full of dishes, we might have a deal." Their easy banter lifted a weight Alexander hadn't even realized he was carrying. With Sarah, he could drop the act, the polished, calculated version of himself that the business world demanded. The next morning, Alexander arrived at Millie's diner earlier than usual. He took his usual seat, but instead of reading the newspaper or checking his phone, he found himself staring out at the street, lost in thought. Sarah's words from the day before still echoed in his mind, as if each conversation with her unlocked something he hadn't quite figured out yet. Moments later, Sarah walked over with his usual coffee and a warm smile. "You're up early today? Something special going on?" Alexander smirked but glanced away. "I think I just like the atmosphere here. It feels more welcoming than the places I'm used to." Sarah sat down for a second, resting her arms on the table. "Fancy spots aren't always the coziest, you know." Before Alexander could respond, Melville appeared from the kitchen, balancing a stack of plates. He barely spared a glance at Alexander before turning to Sarah with a stern look. "Sarah, don't forget to finish that inventory report before your shift is over." Sarah sighed and stood up. "Thanks for the reminder, Melville. I'll take care of it now." She disappeared into the tiny office in the back, leaving Alexander alone with his thoughts. He absent-mindedly watched the other diners for a moment, but something near the counter caught his attention. A small notepad sat there, with a few receipts clipped to the top. Curious, He took a step closer and spotted his own name scribbled on one of the slips. His stomach tightened as he flipped through them. Every meal Sarah had ever given him was listed, but what made his chest tighten was the note at the bottom, deducted from salary. A lump formed in his throat. He already knew she wasn't in the best financial situation, but he never imagined she had been taking money out of her own paycheck just to help him, thinking he was nothing more than a broke, homeless man. Melville, who had been nearby, caught sight of Alexander's tense expression and stepped closer. "Something on your mind, kid?" Alexander quickly shook his head, trying to brush off his unease. "These meals. Sarah's the one paying for them, isn't she?" Melville let out a sigh, crossing his arms. "Yeah, that's Sarah for you. If she sees someone struggling, she helps. Doesn't matter if she's barely getting by herself, she never hesitates." Alexander's respect for Sarah deepened. It wasn't just that she worked tirelessly to support her family. She willingly sacrificed what little she had for people she barely knew. He returned to his seat and waited patiently for her to come back. When Sarah finally reappeared, Alexander gestured subtly for her to come over. "Sarah, I need to ask you something," he said, his voice more serious than usual. "Why do you pay for the meals you give away?" She blinked, caught off guard by the question, but her expression remained steady. "Because somebody has to," she replied simply. "Not everyone can afford a meal, but that doesn't mean they don't deserve one," Alexander pressed further. "And what about you?" He paused, watching her carefully. "Who's looking out for you?" Sarah gave a small smile, but there was something wistful in her eyes. "I don't really think about it. I've always handled things on my own." Alexander wasn't sure how to respond. He wanted to offer his help, but he knew she wouldn't accept it, at least not yet. So instead of pushing, he let the moment pass. "You're one of a kind, Sarah." She chuckled softly, shaking her head like she didn't believe it. "I just do what I can." In the days that followed, Alexander kept coming back to the restaurant, quietly watching Sarah go about her day. Every time she helped someone, he felt a mix of admiration and frustration. He wanted to step in, to do something for her, but he knew he had to be careful. He couldn't reveal who he really was. One afternoon, as Sarah wiped down tables after lunch, Alexander waited until the place had emptied before approaching her. "Sarah," he said, leaning against a nearby chair, "have you ever thought about doing something else? Something you've always wanted to do?" She paused, looking at him thoughtfully. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But life doesn't always give you a choice, you know." Alexander sat with that thought as she went back to work. He couldn't understand how someone so strong, so selfless, could just accept a life full of sacrifices without complaint. In his world of wealth and privilege, that kind of resilience didn't exist. Over the next few days, he started noticing things he hadn't before. The way exhaustion lingered in Sarah's posture, even when she smiled. The way her entire face lit up whenever she mentioned her daughter, Lily. The more he observed, the more he realized there was so much about her life she never let anyone see. That afternoon, as the restaurant quieted down after the lunch rush, Alexander saw his chance to finally talk to Sarah. She was wiping down tables, but paused when he walked up. "You never really told me how you ended up here," Alexander said, keeping his tone light. Sarah gave a small, knowing smile, like she had been expecting the question. "It's a long story." "I've got time," he assured her, his expression encouraging. She let out a slow breath and pulled out a chair, settling into it hesitantly. For a moment, she seemed unsure of where to start, but then she spoke, her voice steady yet soft. "I grew up in a small town. We never had much, but we were happy." She paused briefly before continuing. "After high school, I met someone. He seemed perfect." Alexander stayed quiet, picking up on the sadness woven into her words. "We fell in love fast, too fast. I really thought he was the one." She gave a humorless chuckle. "Then I found out I was pregnant, and just like that, everything changed." Her voice held a quiet pain, but she kept her head high. He walked away, said he wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility. Alexander clenched his jaw, anger flickering inside him. "It was the hardest time of my life. My mum did what she could to help, but not long after she got sick. Juggling her care and raising Lily on my own, it wasn't easy." She exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "I had to come here, to start over, to build something better. That's how I ended up in the military. Alexander swallowed hard. He could hardly wrap his head around how much she had been through, and yet she still carried herself with so much grace, so much quiet strength. And her father, he never came back? He asked, not bothering to hide his frustration. Sarah looked down, her gaze fixed on the floor. No. And honestly, I don't expect him to. I have everything I need, my daughter, my mum. That's enough. Alexander sat with her words for a moment, trying to process all of it. He felt a sharp mix of anger at the man who abandoned her and deep admiration for Sarah's resilience. "You're incredible, you know that?" he finally said. She let out a soft laugh, a hint of gratitude in her eyes. "I just do what I have to do." After a brief, comfortable silence, she stood up and stretched. "All right, time to get back to work. Those dishes aren't going to wash themselves." Alexander chuckled as he watched her walk away, but her words lingered in his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about everything she had endured and how she deserved so much more than what life had given her. Later that evening, as the restaurant emptied out, he spotted Sarah sitting at the counter. She pulled a small photo from her pocket, staring at it with a soft expression. Curious, Alexander walked over. "Is that Lily?" he asked, nodding toward the picture. Sarah found herself reaching toward the photograph. It showed a little girl with bouncy brown curls and a beaming smile. "She's beautiful," Alexander said, genuinely impressed. Sarah's face lit up with pride. "Thank you. She's my greatest joy." Alexander was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Does she know how much you fight for her?" Sarah thought about it for a second before replying, "I think so. I try to show her that no matter how tough things get, there's always something to smile about." Her words struck something deep in Alexander. He had met plenty of strong people in his life, but Sarah's resilience was on a whole different level. She made him want to be better. That night, as he walked home, he knew he had to do something for her and her family. But if he wanted to help, he had to be smart about it. She could never know his real intentions. Learning about Sarah's past had forced Alexander to take a hard look at his own life. He had always thought money and power were the only things that mattered. Yet every second he spent around Sarah made him question that belief. Her simplicity, her strength, her kindness. She had something he'd never found in his world of wealth and influence: authenticity. One afternoon, as he made his way to MILLIONAIRE'S diner, his phone rang. It was his personal assistant, Martin. "Mr. Hayes, the investor meeting has been rescheduled for tomorrow. Should I confirm your attendance?" Martin asked in his usual businesslike tone. Alexander hesitated. Ever since he started coming to this diner, his focus on work had started slipping. He knew he should snap back into control, but something kept pulling him in another direction. "Yeah, confirm it," he said before hanging up. When he got to the restaurant, Sarah was busy running from table to table. He took his usual seat and waited patiently for her to get a free moment. When she finally walked over, her warm smile lit up the whole place, just like always. "The usual?" she asked, ready to jot down his order. "Yeah," he said, leaning in slightly. "But today, I want something else." Sarah raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Something else?" "I want to know more about you." "What do you do when you're not here?" Sarah chuckled softly, like the question had caught her off guard. "Honestly, I don't have much free time. If I'm not here, I'm either taking care of my daughter or helping my mom." Alexander nodded. He had expected that answer. "But if you did have time," he asked, "what would you do?" Sarah paused, thinking it over before answering. "Maybe in another life I would have studied. You always wanted to be a nurse, didn't you? But life had its own agenda." The raw honesty in her voice made Alexander's chest tighten. He couldn't help but wonder how different things could have been if he'd been given better chances. "I'm never really ready to start fresh," he said, attempting to lighten the mood. Sarah offered a small smile, though there was a shadow of sadness behind her eyes. "Maybe. But for now, I just need to take things one step at a time." Watching her walk back to work, Alexander felt conflicted. He knew he had the power to help her rebuild her life, but doing so would mean revealing who he really was, and that was a risk he wasn't sure he was ready to take. That evening, in his office, Alexander sat across from Martin, discussing unfinished company matters, but his thoughts were elsewhere, still lingering on Sarah and her struggles. "You seem distracted, Mr. Hayes," Martin observed, noting the far-off look in Alexander. Alexander exhaled, pressing his palms against the desk. "Ever met someone who makes you question everything?" Martin raised an eyebrow at the unexpected question, hesitating before responding. "Not often, but those kinds of people, they tend to leave a lasting impact." "She's different, Martin. She doesn't care about wealth or power. She gives more than she takes, even when she has nothing to spare." Martin studied him for a moment. "And what about you? Have you told her the truth yet?" Alexander shook his head. "Not yet. She thinks I'm just a regular guy, someone who needs a hand. If she finds out, everything changes." Martin leaned back thoughtfully. "The truth has a funny way of coming out on its own, sir. If you want to keep that connection, you might want to be the one to tell her before she figures it out herself." As Alexander left the office, Martin's words echoed in his mind. A decision was inevitable. He just didn't know if he was ready to make it. Now let's test who actually reads the comments. Drop the word pizza below if you made it this far. All right, back to the story. The next day, Alexander decided to break from his usual routine. He wanted to create a special moment, a chance to grow closer to Sarah, maybe even ease her into the truth. When he walked into Millie's diner, he spotted her wiping down tables. She glanced up, greeting him with a smile, but something in her expression felt different today. "Morning," she said, setting down his usual coffee. "You look like you're up to something." Alexander chuckled, but his eyes held sincerity. "I was hoping to take you out today, just the two of us." Sarah blinked, caught off guard. "Go out? Where?" "Somewhere quiet," he replied. "You deserve a break." She hesitated. Working at the diner gave her a sense of stability, even if it wasn't much, and she'd never really allowed herself to think about what she wanted. But the thought of breaking her routine, even just for a little while, was tempting. And was she actually considering it? "Who's going to keep the place running?" he teased, raising an eyebrow. "I'm sure Mabel can handle things for a few hours," she replied confidently, glancing at the cook. Mabel nodded with an easy smile. After a brief moment of indecision, Sarah gave in. They stepped out of the restaurant together, and Alexander led her to a quiet park on the outskirts of town. Towering trees cast cool shadows, and birds filled the air with their cheerful songs. The peaceful scenery was a stark contrast to the fast-paced, noisy atmosphere of the diner. "It's been forever since I've been somewhere like this," Sarah admitted, her gaze settling on the lake in front of them. Alexander smiled. "Sometimes we just need to unplug, even if it's only for a little while." They strolled side by side, keeping the conversation light. Alexander deliberately avoided anything work, anything that might give away who he really was. He wanted this time to be just about them, free from the complications of his world. As they walked, Sarah opened up more. She shared childhood memories, stories about how she and her mum used to spend time in parks like this before life took a turn. Alexander listened carefully. Despite all she'd been through, there was still a spark of hope in her. "You still managed to stay positive even after everything," he observed. Sarah paused, meeting his gaze with quiet intensity. "Life has taught me that if I only focus on the bad, I'll never notice the good. And there's always something good, even if it's small." Her words stuck with him. He admired her strength. This woman who had been through so much, yet still found beauty in the little things. They eventually settled on a bench by the lake. A comfortable silence fell between them, the kind that didn't need to be filled with words. Sarah looked more at ease than he'd ever seen her. "Thank you for this," she said softly, breaking the silence. "I really needed it." "Anytime," Alexander replied, his voice warm and sincere. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment the world seemed to slow down. There was something unspoken between them, something real. But then Sarah glanced at her watch and sighed. "I should probably get back. I've been gone too long already. Mabel might need me." Alexander nodded, though he wished the moment could last just a little longer. "All right," he said, standing up beside her. "Let's head back." On the way back, Sarah seemed lighter, as if that short break had given her a fresh burst of energy. Alexander, however, felt more determined than ever to help her. He understood that to do so, he would have to take on a greater challenge, telling her the truth about who he really was. When they arrived at MILLIONAIRE'S diner, Sarah dove back into her work with renewed enthusiasm, while Alexander lingered, watching her from a distance. He realized that just being around her was enough to lift his spirits. Later, as she was wiping down tables after lunch, Alexander took advantage of the quiet moment to approach her again. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" She glanced up, curiosity flashing in her eyes. "Of course. If you could change one thing about your life, what would it be?" Sarah paused, considering his question. "I think I'd want more time with my daughter," she admitted. "Working here is important, but sometimes I feel like I'm missing out on moments I can't get back." Her honesty struck Alexander deeply. He knew he had the power to make that wish come true, but he also knew he had to tread carefully. "Lily is lucky to have a mother like you," he said warmly. Sarah smiled in return, but was soon called away by Mabel to tend to a customer. Alexander stayed where he was, reflecting on the strength she displayed every single day. That moment had been special, and yet it brought him closer to the inevitable, revealing his true identity. The more time he spent at MILLIONAIRE'S, the more he realized how much he needed the peace Sarah unknowingly gave him. But as his feelings for her deepened, so did the weight of the secret he carried. Every conversation, every smile they shared made the truth harder to hold back. He knew he couldn't keep this up much longer. One evening, after the diner's busiest hours had passed, Alexander decided to seek advice. He called Martin, his assistant, and asked him to meet him at a quiet cafe. When Martin arrived, he found Alexander staring at his untouched cup of coffee, lost in thought. "Mr. Heiss, this isn't like you," Martin remarked as he slid into the seat across from him. "Something on your mind?" Alexander ran a hand through his hair, his frustration clear. "I don't know what to do, Martin." Martin, used to Alexander's composed and strategic nature, raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Alexander hesitated. "Sarah." A knowing smile crept onto Martin's face. "You're getting in deeper, aren't you?" Alexander nodded. "And that's what worries me. She trusts me, but she doesn't know who I really am. The longer I wait, the harder it gets to tell her." Martin tapped his fingers thoughtfully against the table. "Sir, the truth is never easy, but keeping it hidden only makes things worse when it finally comes out." "I know, but..." Alexander let out a heavy sigh. "What if she never trusts me again?" Martin studied him for a moment before responding. "If her feelings are real, she'll understand, but it's better she hears the truth from you than someone else." Alexander carried those words with him as he walked home. He knew Martin was right, but that didn't make the decision any easier. The next morning, he resolved to come up with a plan to tell Sarah the truth. Carefully, he wanted it to be a moment that showed her his feelings were real, that he cared about her, not his status or wealth. When he arrived at the diner, he noticed Sarah was even busier than usual. Still, he found a chance to bring her a cup of coffee. "You seem more on edge than usual today," he remarked, watching the controlled chaos around them. Sarah exhaled, wiping the sweat from her brow. "We're short-staffed, and Mabel had to leave early." "Why not hire someone else?" he asked without thinking. Sarah let out a short laugh. "If only it were that simple. The diner barely stays afloat as it is." Her words weighed on him. He could fix this with a single phone call, but doing so without raising suspicions was another challenge entirely. Later, when things had quieted down, Alexander asked to speak with Sarah privately. They sat at a small table in the back, away from the last remaining customers. "Sarah, have you thought about taking a day for yourself? Just stepping away from all this, even for a little while?" he asked, holding her gaze. Sarah chuckled softly, shaking her head. "That's not exactly an option for me." "And if I made it possible?" he asked, gauging her reaction. She gave him a skeptical look. "What do you mean?" "I want you to take a day off. No work, no stress, just time for yourself." Sarah studied him, intrigued but hesitant. "I don't know if I can do that." "You don't have to decide now," he assured her with a small smile. "Just think about it." Over the next few days, Alexander continued his usual visits to the diner, while carefully planning how and when he would tell Sarah the truth. Knew that offering her a day off was just the start, his way of showing her that he wanted to be a real part of her life. Then, one evening, after closing up the diner, Sarah finally brought it up. "About what you said the other day," she began, wiping down the counter. "I think I'm going to take you up on that offer." Alexander felt a wave of relief, but kept his composure. "Great, let's make it a special day," he said, suggesting they escape to a peaceful spot outside the city where she could unwind and leave her worries behind. Though hesitant, Sarah agreed. On the planned day, Alexander picked her up from the restaurant and drove her to a small mountain cabin. It was simple yet inviting, nestled in a breathtaking landscape. As she took in the view, Sarah's expression softened. Alexander knew he had made the right choice. "This is amazing," she murmured, mesmerized by the sunset. "You deserve moments like this," he told her, watching her with a quiet smile. As they talked, Alexander felt the moment was right to finally open up. He took a deep breath, ready to speak. But before he could get a word out, Sarah spoke first. "Alexander, I need to tell you something too," she said in a low voice. He was caught off guard but gave her an encouraging nod. "I'm not good at accepting help," she admitted. "I've always handled everything on my own. But with you, it feels different somehow." Her words hit Alexander deeply. He knew he couldn't put off his confession any longer. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you too," he said, his voice steady. Before he could continue, Sarah's phone rang. It was her mum. She needed help with Lily. Apologizing, Sarah quickly left. For the next few days, Alexander couldn't shake the unease settling over him. That moment at the cabin had slipped away, but he knew he couldn't hold back much longer. Each time he visited Millie's diner, anticipation and anxiety weighed on him. The longer he waited, the heavier his secret became. One afternoon, as Sarah wiped down tables, Alexander watched her, lost in thought. She moved so effortlessly through her routine, seemingly unbothered, but he knew his revelation could change everything. "Everything okay?" she asked, noticing his distant expression. He hesitated, then forced a smile. "Yeah, just thinking." Sarah shook her head with a small grin, but didn't press him. She respected his space, and that only made Alexander admire her more. That night, she made up her mind. She'd get to the diner early the next morning and tell him everything before anything else got in the way. The next day, Alexander arrived before opening hours and found Sarah setting up chairs and arranging the counter. She raised an eyebrow at him. "You just can't stay away from a good cup of coffee, can you?" she teased. He chuckled lightly, but his eyes held a seriousness she immediately picked up on. "Actually, that's not why I'm here today." Sarah stopped what she was doing, curiosity flickering across her face. "Is something wrong?" "We need to talk," Alexander said, his tone firm. "About me?" She folded her arms, sensing the weight of his words. "All right? What's going on?" Alexander exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I haven't been completely honest with you. I'm not exactly who you think I am." Sarah's brows knitted together. "What do you mean?" "My full name is Alexander Hayes," he admitted. "I'm a businessman, a millionaire actually." Silence stretched between them. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Wait, what?" "A millionaire," she repeated, almost laughing. "You're joking, right?" He shook his head. "It's true, I should have told you sooner, but I didn't know how. I was afraid of losing your trust." Sarah took a step back, her face shifting from shock to something colder. "So, all this time, you were lying to me?" "No, I wasn't," he said quickly. "At first, I just wanted to understand why you were so kind to me that night. But the more I got to know you, the harder it became to tell you the truth." She stared at him for a long moment, letting his words sink in. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "You really think you can walk in here, pretend to be someone else, and expect me to just accept it?" Alexander felt the sting of disappointment in her tone, but he couldn't walk away now. "Sarah, I never meant to deceive you. I just wanted to—" "What?" she cut in, eyes flashing. "To see how far I'd go? To test me?" He swallowed hard, feeling vulnerable. "I wanted to know what it's like to be seen for who I am, not for what I have," he admitted. "And with you, I finally felt that." Sarah let out a dry laugh, but it carried no warmth. "And now what? You expect me to just forgive you? Pretend this never happened? Alexander took a step closer, his voice softer now. I just want you to know that everything I feel for you is real. My money, my status, none of it matters when I'm with you. She looked away, visibly shaken. I need time to process this. Alexander nodded, giving her the space she asked for. I understand. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to the counter and began stacking glasses, her movements slow and deliberate. Alexander knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to earn back her trust. With no other option, he let her go, watching as she walked out of the restaurant. A hollow feeling settled in his chest, one he had never known before. Wandering the streets, he couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of regret. He had been honest, but the truth had come too late. That night, Zara sat alone in the small apartment she shared with her mum and Lily. Alexander's words kept replaying in her mind. She had heard the sincerity in his voice, yet the sting of betrayal was still too raw. As she watched Lily play with her dolls on the floor, a question nagged at her. Why had Alexander kept up the lie for so long? He wasn't like the other men she'd met, but could she ever trust him again? No matter how much it hurt, Alexander couldn't just walk away. Something deep inside him refused to let go of what they had built. He spent the entire night lying awake, trying to figure out how to fix what he had broken. He understood that words wouldn't be enough this time. If he wanted to prove himself, it had to be through actions, real actions, not grand gestures, not money, but by showing up for her family. By the time the sun came up, he had a plan. It was a risk, but it was his only shot. The next morning, Alexander was set on earning back Sarah's trust. He knew it wouldn't happen overnight, but he was ready to do whatever it took. He spent hours in his office, shifting priorities, cancelling meetings, making it clear to Martin that fixing things with Sarah was his main focus. Martin, though concerned, got the message. Mr. Hayes, maybe it's time to stop talking and start showing her how you feel. Those words stuck with Alexander as he finalized his plan. He needed to do something meaningful, something that wasn't about impressing her, but about proving that he truly cared, and it couldn't involve throwing money around. That afternoon, Alexander found himself back at Millie's diner. Sarah was behind the counter, but when she saw him, the warmth in her expression was gone. Instead, her eyes held caution, maybe even distance. That hurt more than he expected, but he had no one to blame but himself. Sarah, can we talk? He asked, his voice softer than usual. She folded her arms, keeping her guard up. I'm working. I know, he said, but I promise I won't take up much of your time. She sighed, reluctant, but eventually walked with him to a table in the corner. Alexander waited for her to sit before speaking. I know I hurt you, and I can't undo what happened, but I can try to make it right. Sarah stayed quiet, staring down at her hands. You were always kind to me without expecting anything in return, he continued. Now it's my turn to do the same for you. She glanced up, skeptical. I want to help, not with money, not with favors. I just want to support you in chasing your dreams. Her eyes narrowed slightly. What do you mean? You always said you wanted to be a nurse. I want to help make that happen, not by paying for it, just by being there for you. If you ever need someone to watch Lily while you study, I'll be there. If you need encouragement, I'll remind you why you started. This isn't about proving a point, Sarah. I believe in you. She blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. For the first time in days, the walls she had put up seemed to crack just a little. Alexander, I don't know what to say, she murmured, her voice softer than before. You don't have to say anything right now, he assured her, leaning forward. I just want you to know I'm here, however you need me. She sat quietly for a moment, processing his words. Then she stood. I need time to think. Take as long as you need, he said without hesitation. As he watched her walk back to the counter, Alexander knew this wouldn't be easy. He couldn't expect forgiveness overnight, but he was willing to be patient. Over the next few days, he kept his distance, proving his commitment not through words, but through small, meaningful actions. He showed up at the diner regularly, not to push for a conversation, but to help out. He wiped down tables, washed dishes, even took out the trash, much to the shock of Mabel and the other employees. Sarah, though still wary, noticed. Every quiet effort, every thoughtful gesture, it all made a difference. One night, after the diner had closed, she found him stacking chairs. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice serious. Alexander set down the last chair and turned to face her. "Because you deserve to have someone who believes in you, who's willing to show up for you." She sighed, staring at the floor. "Trust doesn't come easy. I don't know if I can just believe in all this." "I don't expect that to change overnight," he said honestly. "But I'll wait as long as it takes." For a moment, neither of them spoke. But the silence between them wasn't as heavy as before. The weight of mistrust had lifted, even if just a little. Then Sarah took a small step closer. Maybe we can try again," she said quietly. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest, but this time he stayed calm. "We'll go at your speed." Sarah gave a small nod and walked away, but there was a subtle shift in her expression, something that hinted she was beginning to lower her defenses. The following morning, Alexander showed up at the diner earlier than usual. In his hand was a simple bouquet of daisies, a detail he remembered from a past conversation where Sarah had mentioned they were her mother's favorite flowers. When she stepped inside and noticed the bouquet resting on the counter, her eyes widened slightly in surprise. "You didn't have to do this," she murmured, though a faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "I wanted to," he said effortlessly. "Just thought it'd be a nice way to start the day." Sarah hesitated for a beat before picking up the flowers, her smile deepening as she glanced at him. "Thank you." There was still a long way to go, but Alexander could feel the small, steady progress he was making. He knew he had to continue proving his commitment, but at that moment, he realized something. Sarah and the chance to build something real with her were worth every effort. Let's see who actually reads the comments. Drop Coca-Cola in the comments section. Only those who made it this far will get it. Now, back to the story. Sarah and Alexander's relationship was unfolding at a slow, careful pace, but the progress was undeniable. The hesitation was still there, but Sarah had begun to let him back into her life. There was something in the way he looked at her, in the way he carried himself, something genuine, something she couldn't ignore. Alexander, on the other hand, was fully committed to proving he deserved her trust. One quiet morning, he walked into MILLIONAIRE'S diner with a plan in mind. He knew that sometimes the smallest gestures could mean everything. As Sarah came over with his usual cup of coffee, he stopped her. "You're not working all day today," he said, his voice carrying a teasing edge. Sarah shot him a curious look, raising an eyebrow. "Oh, and who's covering my bills at the end of the month?" Alexander chuckled but remained firm. "I made arrangements. You deserve a break, and I figured we could do something different." "Alexander, I told you, I can't just take off," she said, shaking her head. "And I told you, I've got it handled." He leaned forward slightly, his tone steady but gentle. "Just trust me. Just this once." She hesitated, her eyes searching his for a moment. Finally, she let out a soft sigh and relented. "All right, but only for today." Alexander grinned, knowing this was another small but significant step forward. Later that day, he took her to a small botanical garden on the outskirts of town, a quiet, hidden gem filled with vibrant flowers and winding paths shaded by towering trees. Sarah was captivated by the scenery, and Alexander couldn't help but watch her reaction with quiet satisfaction. "I had no idea a place like this even existed around here," she murmured as they strolled leisurely along the winding paths. "Sometimes beauty finds us when we're not even looking for it," Alexander replied, his gaze lingering on her. For hours they wandered together, their conversation light and easy, free from the weight of recent truths. As time passed, Sarah began to open up, reminiscing about her childhood and sharing the dreams she once held close. It had been a long time since she felt this at ease, unburdened by the constant worries that usually shadowed her. As the afternoon drew to a close, they settled onto a bench beneath a sprawling tree. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, full of unspoken understanding. Then, breaking the stillness, Sarah admitted, "I know trusting people doesn't come easily to you, Alexander, but I want to try." His chest tightened at her words, his heartbeat quickening. That was all he could ever ask for. When she smiled at him, he felt something shift. Like the walls he had carefully built around himself were finally beginning to crumble. Over the next few days, Alexander found subtle but meaningful ways to support Sarah. One of them was covering part of her mother's medical bills, though he never mentioned it. Sarah only discovered the gesture when the hospital called, informing her that a portion of the debt had been paid anonymously. Later, at the restaurant, she confronted him. "It was you, wasn't it?" Alexander hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I didn't do it to impress you," he said, his voice steady. "I did it because you and your family deserve a break." Sarah exhaled, torn between gratitude and discomfort. "I don't like depending on anyone, Alexander." "I know," he said gently, "but needing help doesn't make you weak. Everyone needs a hand sometimes." She studied him, considering his words before finally nodding. "Thank you." Their relationship continued to deepen, but the real turning point came unexpectedly. One afternoon, as Alexander sat at the restaurant, Sarah's daughter Lily burst through the door, her face glowing with excitement. Fresh out of school, she held up a piece of paper in her small hands. "Mum, look!" she exclaimed, beaming. Sarah took the drawing and smiled. It was a picture of a woman holding a little girl's hand, surrounded by flowers. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, kissing Lily's forehead. Then Lily turned her attention to Alexander, studying him curiously. "Who's that, Mom?" Sarah hesitated for a beat before answering, "He's a friend." Alexander crouched slightly to greet her. "Hey, Lily, I'm Alexander." Lily giggled but quickly ducked behind her mother, peeking at him shyly. That small moment left a deep imprint on Alexander. If he wanted to be part of Sarah's life, he knew he had to earn Lily's trust too. As weeks passed, he became a steady presence in their lives. He joined them on outings, helped Lily with her homework, and slowly became someone Sarah could truly count on. One quiet evening, in Sarah's cozy apartment, Alexander stood in the kitchen preparing a simple meal. Sarah sat at the table, watching him with an amused look. "I never pictured you as someone who could cook," she teased. Alexander chuckled as he placed their plates on the table. "When you live alone, you pick up a few skills." They ate together, laughter filling the space between bites, and with Lily nestled between them, entirely at ease, Alexander found himself experiencing something he never expected, but somehow it felt exactly right. Later that night, as Sarah tucked Lily into bed, Alexander remained in the living room, lost in thought. He hadn't realized how much his life had changed since meeting Sarah. Searching for something real had led him here, to something bigger than himself. When Sarah returned, she settled beside him on the couch. They sat in silence for a moment before she spoke. "Alexander, I know we're still rebuilding things," she admitted, "but I need you to know. I'm starting to believe in us." He reached for her hand, his heart swelling at her words. "That means more than you know." In that moment he knew they had finally reached solid ground, a place where they could begin again, this time with something real. The days passed peacefully, their connection growing stronger, their past barriers slowly fading. Alexander knew it was time to take a step forward, to show Sarah just how serious he was about her. One evening, he decided to do something special. Enlisting Madel's help, he arranged for Sarah to leave work early. Sarah, unsuspecting, stepped outside the restaurant only to find Alexander standing there, a mischievous smile on his face, a picnic basket in hand. "What's this?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "A date invitation," he said, offering his hand. She laughed but took it. "You don't give up, do you?" "Not when it comes to you," he replied as he led her to the car. He drove her to a quiet hillside on the outskirts of town, where the city lights twinkled in the distance. There, he had set up a small picnic, blankets, cushions, and soft candlelight, adding a touch of magic to the night. Sarah took it all in, her eyes shimmering. "You did all this for me. Everything for you," she murmured to Alexander, steadying her as she sat down. Beneath the vast star-speckled sky, they drifted together, their conversation weaving through childhood stories, secret dreams, and the hopes they held for the future. Each shared moment, each small gesture, seemed to draw them closer, etching a memory that neither would ever forget. After finishing their meal, Alexander pushed back his chair and reached for Sarah's hand. "Come with me, I have something to show you," he said, pulling her up gently. They strolled toward the hill's edge, where the wind carried the soft scent of the night air. Taking a steadying breath, Alexander felt the weight of the moment settle over him. Sarah, since the day I met you, everything in my life has shifted in ways I never saw coming. You've shown me what truly matters. You've made me see the world through a different lens, and above all else, you've taught me what love really means. Sarah gazed up at him, her eyes glistening under the night sky. Alexander took her hands in his voice steady but filled with emotion. I want to be the person who stands beside you, who lifts you up, who makes you smile. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold still. A rush of emotions surged through Sarah, pushing aside any lingering doubts. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, feel it in the way he held her hands, and then a slow, warm smile spread across her face. Yes, Alexander, she whispered. I do. A grin broke across his face, but before he could say another word, Sarah pulled him into a tight embrace. He held her close, as if anchoring himself in the moment, in the certainty of them. Everything finally made sense. They spent the rest of the evening lost in laughter and quiet conversation, reveling in each other's company. For the first time, Alexander, who had always felt out of place at grand events and extravagant parties, realized he had found where he truly belonged. In the days that followed, their bond deepened. Alexander made a habit of surprising her with small, thoughtful gestures, leaving fresh flowers at her restaurant, taking Lily for a walk when Sarah needed a break. In return, Sarah showered him with affection in her own way, preparing home-cooked meals or slipping handwritten notes into his coat pocket, filled with sweet words just for him. Then one day, Sarah made a decision that she knew was significant. She took Alexander to meet her mother. It wasn't something she did lightly, and Alexander understood just how big of a step it was. As they arrived at the modest apartment, he felt a mix of nerves and anticipation buzzing under his skin. "Mum, this is Alexander," Sarah said, her voice laced with both excitement and a hint of apprehension. Her mother, a warm-faced woman with knowing eyes, studied him for a moment before a smile softened her features. "Ah, so you're the Alexander I've been hearing about," she said, offering her hand. "That would be me," he answered with an easy smile, shaking her hand respectfully. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Miller." They settled into the cozy living room, and as the evening unfolded, the conversation flowed effortlessly, filling the space with laughter, stories, and a growing sense of belonging. Alexander listened intently as Sarah's mum shared stories from her childhood. Every reaction he had made Sarah feel even more connected to him. After a while, her mum smiled and said, "He seems like a good man, Alexander. I hope you'll take care of my daughter." "I promise I will," he assured her with genuine sincerity. As they left, walking toward the car, Sarah turned to Alexander with a grateful smile. "She liked you. That's a relief." "Told you not to worry," he teased, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. Over the next few months, their bond grew even stronger. Alexander made a conscious effort to balance his work life with the time he spent with Sarah and Lily. What had once seemed like an unlikely trio now felt like a natural, unbreakable unit. One evening, after putting Lily to bed, Sarah returned to the living room to find Alexander waiting with 2 glasses of wine. "A toast, to us," he said, handing her one. "And to our future," she added, clinking her glass against his. As they sat together on the couch, they spoke about their dreams. Sarah mentioned she was thinking of going back to school, and for the first time, Alexander felt like their visions of the future truly aligned. "I'll be with you every step of the way, Sarah," he promised, taking her hand. She smiled, her eyes shining. "I know." At that moment, Alexander realized he had found something priceless. Love built on trust, respect, and deep admiration. He knew he'd do everything in his power to protect and nurture it for the rest of his life. Sarah made an important decision. She was going to become a nurse, a dream she had held onto for years. With Alexander's unwavering support, she enrolled in a prep course and soon began attending classes. Juggling work, school, and raising Lily was exhausting, but for the first time, she felt like she was on the right path. Alexander did everything he could to make things easier for her, adjusting his work schedule so he could pick up Lily from school and spend quality time with her, allowing Sarah to focus on her studies. Every milestone she reached was celebrated, strengthening their relationship even more. One night, after Sarah finished one of her toughest exams, Alexander surprised her with a special dinner at his place. The dining table was elegantly set with candles and flowers, creating an intimate atmosphere. "What's all this?" Sarah asked, beaming as she walked in. "A celebration," Alexander said, pulling out a chair for her. "You're doing amazing, and that deserves to be recognized." They laughed, reminiscing about their journey together. As the night came to a close, Alexander reached for her hands, his heart pounding. "Sarah, since the day you walked into my life, everything changed. You showed me what really matters, gave me a purpose I never knew I needed." She bit her lip, her eyes filled with emotion. He took a deep breath and pulled out a small velvet box from his pocket. Flipping it open, he revealed a simple yet stunning diamond ring, exactly the kind he knew she'd love. "Sarah, will you marry me?" For a moment she was speechless, tears brimming in her eyes. Then she smiled, her answer clear. "Yes, Alexander, I'd love to." He slid the ring onto her finger before pulling her into his arms, their excitement for the future overwhelming. In the months that followed, they started planning their wedding, but life had another surprise in store. One morning, Sarah felt a sudden wave of dizziness and decided to take a pregnancy test. When the positive result appeared, shock quickly turned into pure joy. Eager to tell Alexander, she waited until he came home that evening. As he stepped through the door, she greeted him with a mysterious smile. "I have something for you," she said, handing him a small box. Alexander opened it, revealing a tiny pair of baby shoes. He stared at them in confusion before realization dawned. "Are you—" His voice caught in his throat. Sarah nodded, grinning. "We're having a baby." Without hesitation, Alexander pulled her into a tight embrace, tears welling up in his eyes. This was the best news he could have ever received. That night they stayed up late, imagining what life would be like as their family grew. When Lily found out, she wasn't exactly thrilled about becoming a big sister, but deep down she was just as excited. Finally, the wedding day arrived. The ceremony took place in a gorgeous garden surrounded by blooming flowers, with close friends and family gathered to celebrate their love. Sarah looked radiant in a simple yet elegant gown, her happiness glowing from within. Alexander, in a perfectly tailored suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle. Their vows were filled with raw emotion, bringing tears to the eyes of their loved ones. Taking Sarah's hands, Alexander spoke with sincerity. "I promise to love you, support you, and stand by your side through every moment of our lives." And with those words, their forever began. "And I vow to stand by your side as your partner, your confidant, and your best friend through every twist and turn life throws our way." Sarah's face lit up with a radiant smile. When they were finally pronounced husband and wife, Alexander pulled her into a kiss, met with cheers and laughter from their loved ones. It was the start of a brand new chapter, and they were ready to embrace it together. A few months after their wedding, Sarah gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. They named him Noah, a name that symbolized the fresh beginning this new journey represented for both of them. Noah's arrival filled their home with even more love and happiness. Alexander found himself experiencing a kind of fulfillment he had never imagined. Together, they built a life rooted in love, trust, and unwavering support. Sarah went on to complete her studies and became a compassionate, dedicated nurse, while Alexander remained her rock, standing by her through every milestone. What began as a simple act of kindness in a restaurant had blossomed into a heartfelt love story, one that proved when two souls truly connect, anything is possible. What are your thoughts on Sarah and Alexander's journey? Share your opinion in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on more amazing stories. And for even more heartfelt tales, click right here on the screen.